For 10 years, the most famous war in Western history dragged on without resolution. Thousands died, cities emptied, kingdoms bled resources, and all of it, we are told, began because of a woman. But wars that last a decade are never about love. They are about access, control, and money. This matters because Troy was not just a legendary city of poets. It sat at one of the most critical trade choke points of the ancient world, controlling the flow of goods between the Aegean and the Black Sea. Whoever controlled Troy controlled grain, metals, and maritime tolls, and that meant power. Picture the Dardanelles at dusk, wind pushing against ships struggling through narrow waters, fortified walls watching every sail pass by, merchants calculating costs, rulers calculating losses. This was not a romantic battlefield. It was an economic pressure point. So, before we start unraveling this, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I want you to comment below. Do you think wars are remembered for their causes or for the stories that make them acceptable? Now let's step into the past and see how the machinery of this world actually worked. Troy mattered because it sat in the wrong place. Or rather, the perfect one. Long before poets turned it into a symbol of love and loss, Troy was a fortified city overlooking a narrow, difficult stretch of water. Ships moving between the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea had no choice but to pass close to its shores. Winds were unreliable. Currents were strong. Vessels often had to wait days, sometimes weeks, for the right conditions. Waiting costs money, and someone always gets paid. You might think ancient trade flowed freely, guided by mutual benefit. In reality, trade flowed through bottlenecks, and bottlenecks created leverage. Troy was not powerful because of its size. It was powerful because it could observe, delay, tax, and control movement. This is the first correction. The Trojan War is usually imagined as a clash between heroic kingdoms. But the strategic reality is simpler. Troy functioned as a gatekeeper. It did not need to conquer others. It only needed to sit still and watch commerce pass beneath its walls. Now slow down and look at the evidence like an archaeologist. Excavations at Hazarlik, the site identified with Troy, show repeated layers of fortification. Thick walls, reinforced gates, towers oriented not toward open land, but toward approaches from the sea and nearby plains. This is not the architecture of a ceremonial city. It is the architecture of a toll station that expects trouble. Trade goods found in and around Troy reinforce the picture. Objects from the Aegean, from Anatolia, from regions connected to the Black Sea. This was not an isolated city. It was a node, and nodes accumulate wealth without expanding territory. That kind of wealth attracts attention. For Mycenaean kingdoms across the Aegean, Troy represented a persistent problem. Their ships carried oil, wine, textiles, and metal. Every delay meant spoiled goods, restless crews, rising costs. Every payment made Troy richer without firing an arrow. Control without conquest is infuriating. Now consider the human experience. A Mycenaean merchant waits offshore, watching Troy's walls while wind refuses to cooperate. Supplies run low. Crew morale drops. A local official arrives, polite, firm, expensive. Nothing here feels like war. It feels like dependence. Dependence breeds resentment faster than violence. This is where myth later steps in. Stories about honor, insult, and divine will are far easier to tell than stories about tariffs and choke points. A king cannot easily rally allies by saying, "Our profit margins are being squeezed," but he can rally them by saying, "Our honor has been stolen." And so economics becomes narrative. Here's the quiet irony. Troy's greatest strength was that it did not need to move. While Mycenaean power depended on ships, alliances, and seasonal campaigning, Troy's power depended on geography. Geography does not get tired. Armies do. A city that controls a gate can afford patience. This patience shaped everything that followed. The war did not begin because Troy was weak. It began because Troy was too stable, too insulated, too profitable, too comfortable blocking others without attacking them. For the Greek coalition, removing Troy was not about revenge. It was about reopening the system. And systems, once blocked long enough, tend to be reopened violently. Before there was Helen, before there were gods arguing on Olympus, there was a city that made money by standing still, and others who could not afford to let it continue. That is the world we are entering. Gold moves more quietly than armies. And in the world of the late Bronze Age, it moved by sea. Once you strip away the poetry, the Trojan War begins to look less like a feud and more like a balance sheet problem. The Mycenaean kingdoms were not unified by culture or loyalty. They were unified by ships, and ships existed to move value. Oil, wine, ceramics, copper, tin. Without access to long-distance trade, palace economies stalled. Without metal, weapons and tools stopped being made. Without steady flow, authority weakened. This is where Troy became intolerable. You might think the Achaeans could simply sail around it. Geography says otherwise. The narrow waters near the Dardanelles were treacherous. Wind patterns forced ships close to shore. Anchoring offshore meant vulnerability. Waiting meant cost. Every delay multiplied losses, not just in goods, but in political credibility back home. Kings rule on promises. Trade fulfills them. The Mycenaean palaces operated on redistribution. Goods came in, were stored, counted, and redistributed to craftsmen, soldiers, and elites. This system required predictability. When trade routes became unreliable, the entire palace economy felt the strain, not immediately, but steadily. Now look at Troy again, but this time not as a city. Look at it as an accounting position. Troy did not need to conquer Mycenae. It did not need to raid. It simply needed to remain in place and extract value from movement. A toll, a delay, a gift, a negotiated passage. Individually trivial, collectively enormous. That kind of income is uniquely dangerous because it rewards obstruction, not cooperation. From Troy's perspective, nothing was wrong. The city prospered. Walls were maintained. Alliances held. The system worked. But from the Mycenaean perspective, Troy was a parasite embedded in the network, profiting from everyone else's effort while contributing nothing to the system's expansion. Here comes the pivot. You might think war begins when diplomacy fails. In this case, war began when diplomacy succeeded too well, but only for one side. As long as Troy could negotiate from a position of geographic advantage, there was no incentive to change behavior. Each successful season reinforced the model. Wealth flowed in. Stability increased. Confidence hardened. And hardened confidence invites force. The human cost appears first not on battlefields, but in ports. Crews waiting longer than expected. Supplies running low. Merchants returning with partial cargoes. Palace officials explaining shortfalls. Soldiers paid late. Craftsmen waiting for metal that never arrives. No one writes epics about this stage. But this is where wars are actually born. Mycenaean rulers faced a choice. Accept permanent dependence on a choke point they did not control, or remove the choke point entirely. Negotiation had reached its limit because the structural imbalance remained. Troy did not need compromise. The Achaeans did. So pressure accumulated. And pressure seeks release. This reframes the famous coalition. A decade-long siege only makes sense if the objective was not punishment, but systemic change. Destroy the city. Remove the gatekeeper. Reopen the route. Even a costly war becomes rational if the long-term economic return outweighs the immediate expense. And this also explains the duration. 10 years is not a romantic number. It is an economic one. Long enough to exhaust defenders. Long enough to outlast reserves. Long enough to break a system designed for patience, not siege. Troy had walls. It had geography. What it lacked was redundancy. Once cut off from trade, the city's strength became its weakness. The same location that generated wealth now trapped it. Goods stopped flowing in. Allies hesitated. Reserves dwindled. Confidence cracked. The siege was not about constant fighting. It was about waiting. Waiting for stores to run low. Waiting for morale to erode. Waiting for trust to fail. This is why the story of Helen persists. A narrative about honor disguises the fact that the war was fundamentally about access. It makes violence feel meaningful instead of mechanical. It transforms economic coercion into moral destiny. People remember stories. They forget logistics. By the time Troy fell, the economic system it had controlled was already shifting. The destruction of the city did not just end a war. It restructured regional power. Trade routes reopened. Wealth redistributed. New tensions emerged elsewhere. The city vanished. The system moved on. Troy did not fall because it was immoral or arrogant. It fell because controlling a gate eventually convinces others that the gate must be destroyed. That is the logic of choke points. And it is older than myth. A war that lasts 10 years is not sustained by rage. It is sustained by logistics. Once the Mycenaean coalition committed to removing Troy, they entered a problem far more complex than battle. Armies could not simply charge the walls and be done. Troy was fortified, supplied by land routes, and protected by terrain that punished haste. So the conflict settled into something slower, more grinding, and far more expensive. A siege. Sieges are not about heroism. They are about accounting. Every day an army remains in the field, it consumes food, water, equipment, and patience. Ships must arrive with supplies. Camps must be maintained. Soldiers must be paid, fed, and kept from desertion. In the Bronze Age, there was no standing national army supported by taxation. Kings financed war through their palaces, their estates, and, crucially, through continued access to trade, which creates an immediate contradiction. The war against Troy was meant to reopen trade routes, but the war itself blocked those routes. Mycenaean ships that once carried goods now carried soldiers and grain. Merchant crews became transport crews. Profitable voyages were replaced by costly rotations. Every month the siege continued, the economic pressure on the attackers increased. This is the first uncomfortable reality. The Greeks were bleeding economically long before Troy fell. You might think a coalition of kings could share the burden evenly. In reality, coalitions fracture under cost. Each ruler arrived with his own interests, his own limits, his own political risks back home. As resources drained, cooperation required constant renegotiation. Who supplies more ships? Who feeds more men? Who stays another season? War became diplomacy by other means. And diplomacy under scarcity is brittle. Now look at Troy again, not as a victim, but as a defender under siege. The city was not built for isolation. Its strength lay in exchange. Goods moving through, wealth circulating, allies trading. Once cut off from maritime traffic, Troy depended on overland supply routes and stored reserves. Those reserves were finite. Archaeological evidence from the relevant destruction layer shows signs consistent with long-term stress, hastily repaired walls, reuse of materials, changes in diet inferred from animal remains. These are not the marks of a city taken by surprise. They are the marks of a city enduring pressure. Waiting changes societies. Inside Troy, rationing would have altered daily life. Social tensions rise when scarcity replaces abundance. Elites argue over priorities. Soldiers question leadership. Civilians lose patience with both. The walls still stand, but cohesion weakens. Outside the walls, the same process unfolds. Greek camps were not unified spaces. They were clusters of rival households, each with its own hierarchy. Discipline had to be maintained across linguistic, cultural, and political differences. Supplies arrived irregularly. Disease spread easily. Morale fluctuated with the seasons. This is where myth fills the gaps. Epic poetry remembers duels, insults, quarrels between heroes. These are not distractions from reality. They are reflections of it. When wars stall, internal conflict surfaces. Pride replaces progress. Individual status matters more because collective success feels distant. A stalled siege produces heroes because it lacks outcomes. Now consider the famous length of the war again. 10 years is not excessive for a siege aimed at economic strangulation. It is the expected time frame when neither side can achieve quick dominance. The attackers wait for collapse. The defenders wait for the coalition to fracture. Both sides bet on endurance. But endurance is asymmetric. Troy depended on a single city. The Greeks depended on many fragile homelands. Every year the war dragged on. Pressure accumulated in Greece itself. Fields left untended. Political rivals exploiting absence. Trade disruptions spreading instability beyond the battlefield. A king who stayed too long risked returning to a weaker throne. Victory had to come eventually, or the war would defeat its own initiators. This explains something often overlooked. Why the Trojan horse appears at all. Not as clever trickery, but as a symptom. When wars reach the point where normal strategies no longer work, desperation sets in. Innovation appears not because of brilliance, but because time has run out. The horse represents a failure of siege logic, a moment where patience collapses. And patience collapses first for the side paying more. By the late stages, the Greek coalition could no longer afford to wait indefinitely. The economic return of destroying Troy had to be realized soon, or the entire project would become a net loss. That urgency shaped decisions. Inside Troy, trust was already eroding. Scarcity forces compromise. Compromise creates vulnerability. Long sieges end not with walls breached, but with systems failing. That is the real story behind prolonged wars. They are not contests of strength. They are contests of accounting errors, morale depletion, and timing. When Troy finally fell, it was not because the city misunderstood honor. It was because the economic system that once made it powerful could not survive isolation indefinitely. And when the city burned, it marked not just the end of a place, but the violent correction of a trade imbalance that had become intolerable. The myths remember the fire. They forget the invoices. When wars drag on, something subtle happens to truth. It becomes expensive. As the siege of Troy stretched from season to season, both sides faced a growing problem that had nothing to do with walls or weapons. They needed to justify the cost to their allies, their soldiers, and themselves. Sustained warfare demands meaning. At first, that meaning is practical. Control the route, break the gate, reopen trade. But practical reasons age poorly. They sound thin after years of hunger, loss, and exhaustion. No one wants to keep paying for a ledger entry. So the war needed a story. This is where myth does its real work. You might think stories about gods and heroes exist because people were naive. In reality, they exist because they are economically efficient. A story can motivate where incentives fail. It can turn sunk costs into destiny. As the conflict dragged on, the language around it likely shifted. What began as a campaign to remove a strategic obstacle became framed as a matter of honor, oath, and divine will. Once framed that way, withdrawal was no longer just costly, it was shameful. And shame is harder to calculate than gold. Inside the Greek coalition, this narrative was essential. Kings had left their lands for years. Fields lay untended. Rivals stirred. Authority weakened with absence. Returning home empty-handed was not an option. Victory had to be total, or the entire effort would be remembered as folly. The story ensured commitment. But stories have consequences. Once war becomes sacred, compromise becomes betrayal. Negotiated settlement, always cheaper than total destruction, becomes impossible. The enemy must be punished, not merely neutralized. This is how limited wars become absolute ones. Now look at Troy through this lens. The longer the siege lasted, the more Troy's destruction became symbolically necessary. It was no longer enough to reopen trade. The city itself had to disappear. Its walls, its people, its memory as a toll collector had to be erased. Economics demanded removal. Narrative demanded annihilation. Inside Troy, myth worked differently. Defenders did not need a story of destiny. They needed one of endurance. As long as the city held, its legitimacy remained intact. Each year survived reinforced belief in protection, divine, geographic, or political. Walls that hold become sacred. Survival becomes proof. This is why long sieges are psychologically dangerous for defenders. Each success raises expectations. Each delay increases the shock when failure finally arrives. When systems finally break, they break catastrophically. Archaeological layers associated with Troy's destruction show signs consistent with this pattern. Not a city taken swiftly, but one exhausted. Repairs become hurried. Materials reused. Diets change. These are the fingerprints of a population adapting under pressure. Adaptation keeps you alive. It also hides how close you are to collapse. Outside the walls, the Greek camps experience their own distortions. Time in limbo reshapes priorities. Individual reputation replaces collective purpose. Quarrels between leaders become prominent because outcomes are delayed. Epic tradition preserves these conflicts not because they are dramatic inventions, but because they reflect stalled progress. When wars stop moving forward, they turn inward. This is the stage where extreme solutions emerge. The Trojan horse belongs here, not as a tale of brilliance, but as evidence that normal siege logic had failed. It appears when patience is exhausted and risk becomes acceptable, when the cost of waiting one more season outweighs the danger of an untested idea. Such moments do not arise in confident systems. They arise in systems running out of time. Inside Troy, prolonged pressure had already altered decision-making. Scarcity erodes caution. Trust becomes thinner. Social hierarchies strain. When a long siege convinces a population that survival itself is a miracle, improbable actions become plausible. This is not stupidity. It is fatigue. And fatigue is the most reliable ally of collapse. By the final phase, both sides were trapped by the story they had created. The Greeks could not leave. Troy could not yield. The The conflict had moved beyond economics into identity. At that point, destruction becomes inevitable, not because anyone desires it, but because no alternative remains acceptable. When the city finally fell, it was not simply a military event. It was a narrative conclusion. The destruction justified the cost retroactively. It transformed years of loss into a story worth telling. And that story survived. What did not survive was the city that once controlled the gate. This is the pattern worth remembering. Wars that begin for practical reasons often end for symbolic ones. Economics opens the conflict. Myth closes it. The longer the delay, the greater the violence required to make the story feel complete. Troy's fate was sealed not when the first ship arrived, but when the war became too expensive, materially and psychologically, to end any other way. The Trojan horse did not succeed because it was clever. It succeeded because systems under exhaustion stopped behaving like systems. By the final phase of the war, Troy was no longer operating as a confident gatekeeper of trade. It was operating as a besieged organism making decisions under prolonged stress. This distinction matters because stress changes how risk is evaluated. In stable conditions, cities rely on procedures. Gates open and close by rule. Foreign objects are inspected. Threats are treated conservatively. In unstable conditions, procedure gives way to judgment, and judgment deteriorates under fatigue. Years of isolation had altered Troy's internal balance. Resources were thinner, authority more contested, confidence increasingly symbolic rather than material. The city had survived not because it was thriving, but because it was enduring. Endurance feels like strength until the moment it fails. The horse enters at precisely this point, not as a miracle of ingenuity, but as a test of a system already weakened. You might think the Trojans were foolish to bring it inside their walls, but consider the pressures acting on them. The enemy appeared to be leaving. The beaches emptied. Ships were gone. The object left behind was ambiguous, neither clearly hostile nor clearly harmless. Ambiguity is dangerous to exhausted systems. Removing the object entirely would require labor, coordination, and consensus. Destroying it would require certainty. Leaving it outside would prolong tension. Bringing it inside promised closure. Closure is seductive when uncertainty has lasted too long. Inside the city, social dynamics had shifted as well. Long sieges redistribute power. Military leaders gain prominence. Civil authorities lose influence. Religious interpretations gain weight because they offer certainty where material analysis cannot. The horse was framed as a ritual object, a sign, a message. Once meaning attaches to an object, technical evaluation often stops. Symbol displaces inspection. This is not unique to Troy. Complex societies routinely make their worst decisions when symbolic relief outweighs analytical caution. At the same time, the attackers were facing their own deadline. The coalition could not sustain indefinite presence. Political costs at home were rising. Resources were strained. A decisive outcome was required, even if it carried risk. The horse was not a gamble born of confidence. It was a gamble born of necessity. This convergence matters. The defenders were tired of waiting. The attackers were running out of time. Both sides were pushed toward extremes by the same force, prolonged economic and psychological pressure. Once inside the walls, the horse did not defeat Troy on its own. It simply exploited a failure of internal control. Coordination collapsed. Trust broke down. Defense fragmented. A system designed to regulate gates and movement could not respond coherently to an internal shock. Cities fall fastest from the inside. Archaeological evidence supports this kind of ending. The destruction layer associated with Troy shows signs of sudden internal catastrophe rather than prolonged street-by-street fighting. Fire spreads rapidly. Structures collapse. The city does not reorganize. It breaks. This suggests a breakdown of command more than a gradual conquest, which aligns with the logic of exhaustion. The Trojan horse, stripped of poetry, represents the final stage of economic war. When control of access has already failed and endurance has already depleted reserves, a single breach, physical or procedural, becomes fatal. The story survives because it is simple, a trick, a mistake, a moment. The reality is heavier. The city fell because it had spent years surviving a pressure it was never designed to endure indefinitely. Geography gave Troy leverage. Time took it away. Once the gatekeeper could no longer control the gate, externally or internally, the system collapsed rapidly. This is why the myth endures. It compresses a long, expensive, grinding failure into a single dramatic image. It makes collapse legible. It turns exhaustion into error. But the real lesson sits beneath the story. When power is built on control of access rather than adaptability, prolonged disruption is fatal, not because walls fall, but because decision-making degrades. When that happens, even a wooden object can become decisive, not because it is clever, but because the system it enters is already breaking. When Troy burned, it solved one problem and created several others. Removing the gatekeeper did reopen access to the Black Sea. Ships could pass more freely. Trade resumed. Metals, grain, and goods flowed again. From a narrow economic perspective, the war achieved its objective. But wars that last this long rarely end cleanly. The Mycenaean world that returned home was not the same world that had left. 10 years of sustained warfare had reshaped it. Palace economies had been stretched to their limits. Reserves were drained. Fields neglected. Administrative systems strained by prolonged absence of leadership. The victory over Troy did not restore stability. It exposed fragility that had been masked by the external focus of war. This is the first uncomfortable consequence. The coalition that destroyed Troy did not emerge stronger. It emerged exhausted. Archaeological evidence across the Aegean points to disruption rather than consolidation in the decades following the Trojan War horizon. Palatial centers show signs of stress, rebuilding, fortification changes, shifts in storage patterns. These are not marks of triumphant expansion. They are signs of systems compensating for loss. Victory did not repay the cost. It redistributed it. Now consider the human dimension. Kings returned after years of absence to societies that had adapted without them. Authority was no longer unquestioned. Power balances had shifted. Rivals had grown bolder. Loyalty had thinned. The very leaders who led the war now faced instability at home. Epic tradition preserves this indirectly. Stories of troubled homecomings, internal conflict, and fractured households dominate post-war myth. These are not simply moral tales. They reflect real social tension created by prolonged extraction of manpower and resources. War solved the external blockage. It destabilized the internal system. This pattern repeats throughout history. When war becomes the primary tool for economic correction, it tends to damage the structures that make correction sustainable. The Trojan War fits this logic precisely. The Mycenaean palaces depended on trade to function. War disrupted trade for a decade. Even after victory, networks had to be rebuilt. Relationships had to be renegotiated. Confidence took time to return, if it returned at all. Some centers never fully recovered. Within a few generations, the late Bronze Age world began to unravel. Trade networks collapsed. Writing systems disappeared. Palaces fell. Populations moved. The causes were complex: climate stress, migration, internal conflict, but long, expensive wars contributed to the fragility. Troy was not the sole cause. It was part of a systemic shock. By removing a critical node violently rather than integrating or bypassing it, the Mycenaean world chose a solution that fixed access but damaged resilience. The system became more open, but less stable. This is the paradox of chokepoint warfare. Destroying a gate removes obstruction, but it also removes regulation. Flows increase, but coordination weakens. Power fragments rather than consolidates. After Troy, no single city replaced its role as gatekeeper. Control dispersed. Competition intensified. Without a stable regulating node, the system became vulnerable to disruption from multiple directions. Short-term gain. Long-term volatility. This helps explain why the story of Troy survived while the world that fought it did not. Myth preserves clarity. History preserves complexity. The war is remembered as a decisive moment because it feels decisive. In reality, it marked a transition from one unstable equilibrium to another, one that ultimately proved unsustainable. Troy controlled access and provoked war. Its destruction removed control and invited chaos. Neither state was stable indefinitely, and this leads to a deeper insight. The Trojan War was not an aberration. It was an early example of a recurring problem in complex systems. When economic pressure builds around a bottleneck, violence becomes the chosen solution, not because it is optimal, but because it feels final. Finality is appealing to exhausted systems. But finality rarely delivers stability. It delivers change, often at a higher cost than anticipated. The fall of Troy did not end struggle in the region. It rearranged it. Power shifted. Networks reformed imperfectly. The Bronze Age world moved closer to a breaking point already approaching from multiple directions. The city burned. The system kept trembling. And in that sense, Troy's story is not just about a city that fell, but about a world that was already learning, painfully, that solving economic problems through war creates debts that history always collects later. What Troy reveals, once the smoke clears, is not a lesson about deception. It is a lesson about economic impatience. The destruction of the city solved a specific blockage, but it did so by removing a stabilizing node from a fragile network. For a brief moment, this felt like liberation. Ships moved again. Routes reopened. The pressure that had justified a decade of war seemed to lift. But systems that rely on choke points do not become healthy when choke points are destroyed. They become unregulated. Before the war, Troy acted as a predictable obstacle. Annoying, expensive, but stable. Merchants planned around it. Kings negotiated with it. The system, though constrained, was legible. After Troy, that legibility vanished. Trade did not return to a neutral baseline. It fragmented. Smaller powers competed to control stretches of sea and land. Local conflicts replaced centralized friction. Instead of one expensive delay, there were many unpredictable ones. This is a familiar pattern in economic history. Removing a bottleneck violently rarely creates efficiency. It creates volatility. The Mycenaean world, already strained by years of mobilization, now had to manage increased competition without the administrative capacity to regulate it. Palaces that once coordinated exchange struggled to reassert control. Without a dominant gatekeeper, power dispersed unevenly. Some regions benefited temporarily. Others collapsed. This uneven recovery intensified inequality across the network. Prosperity clustered where geography and luck aligned. Elsewhere, scarcity deepened. The system lost its ability to distribute shock evenly. That ability, more than wealth itself, is what sustains complex societies. At the same time, the habits learned during the war did not disappear. Long campaigns normalized militarized solutions. Kings accustomed to solving problems through force continue to reach for force even when conditions change. The Trojan War did not end a militarized mindset. It entrenched one. This had consequences. Internal disputes that might once have been resolved through negotiation increasingly escalated. Raiding became more common. Defensive fortifications multiplied. Trust declined. The logic of war leaked into peacetime. These shifts are visible archaeologically. Across the Aegean, settlements show increased fortification and reduced openness in the generations following the war horizon. This is not expansion. It is anxiety expressed in stone. Economic systems under anxiety behave defensively. They hoard. They fortify. They shorten planning horizons. All of this reduces long-term resilience. The destruction of Troy also removed a reference point. As long as the city stood, it embodied a known problem with known parameters. Once it vanished, the system lost a focal point for coordination, even adversarial coordination. Paradoxically, enemies can stabilize systems by being predictable. When Troy fell, predictability fell with it. The war's legacy, then, was not peace or prosperity, but instability disguised as freedom. This reframes the famous question of winners and losers. The attackers won tactically. The region lost structurally. The war achieved its immediate economic objective, but at the cost of undermining the mechanisms that made economic coordination possible. The Mycenaean world traded a controlled constraint for an uncontrolled environment and lacked the institutional capacity to manage that transition. This is why the Trojan War feels like a hinge in history. Not because it caused the Bronze Age collapse by itself, but because it exposed how little margin for error the system had left. It was one shock among many, but a revealing one. When systems are healthy, shocks are absorbed and redistributed. When systems are brittle, shocks propagate and amplify. The Trojan War amplified fragility. And fragility does not need a single cause to become fatal. It only needs time. The city burned once. The consequences spread for generations. What followed the Trojan War was not immediate collapse. It was disorientation. The networks that had once structured movement, exchange, and expectation across the Aegean no longer behaved as they had before. Routes still existed. Ships still sailed. Goods still moved. But coordination weakened, and with it, confidence. This distinction matters. Complex systems do not fail when activity stops. They fail when signals lose meaning. Before Troy fell, delays had a source. Costs had a reason. Negotiations had a focal point. After its destruction, friction became diffuse. No single authority controlled passage. No predictable intermediary existed. Traders faced a patchwork of local powers, each asserting claims over small stretches of space. Transaction costs rose, not because of one barrier, but because of many. In such conditions, long-distance trade becomes riskier. Merchants shorten routes. Specialization declines. Palaces that once depended on wide networks struggle to secure consistent supply. This does not produce famine overnight. It produces contraction. Evidence for this appears gradually. Storage systems shrink. Imported goods become rarer. Craft production simplifies. Regions turn inward, prioritizing survival over surplus. The system does not collapse, it loses complexity. This is crucial. The late Bronze Age world was highly interconnected. That connectivity made it prosperous, but also vulnerable. Removing a key node violently without replacing it with a regulating structure increased volatility across the network. The Trojan War did not end the system. It made it harder to maintain. At the same time, political culture had shifted. A generation of leaders had learned that prolonged force could resolve economic problems. This lesson lingered. When new pressures arose, competition over land, access to resources, demographic stress, the default response was coercive. But coercion scales poorly in fragmented systems. Local conflicts multiplied. Alliances became shorter-lived. Trust eroded faster than institutions could repair it. Each conflict consumed resources that might otherwise have rebuilt coordination. This is where cumulative stress becomes visible. By the late 13th century BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean faced multiple pressures: climatic variability affecting harvests, population movement, internal instability, and weakening trade networks. None of these alone were fatal. Together, they overwhelmed a system already operating with reduced buffers. The Trojan War sits within this convergence. It did not cause the crisis, but it contributed to structural thinning. By exhausting elites, draining treasuries, and destabilizing trade regulation, it reduced the capacity to respond flexibly when new shocks arrived. This is how large collapses actually form, not through a single blow, but through the accumulation of adaptations that make future adaptation harder. The myths that survive from this period reflect that sense of loss. They speak of a world where heroes return to ruins, where order does not resume, where violence echoes rather than resolves. These stories are not memories of one city's fall. They are reflections of systemic disintegration. People sensed that something larger had broken, but they could not name it. They named heroes instead. The Trojan War became a symbolic marker because it sat at the edge of understanding. It felt like an ending, even though the true ending unfolded over decades. This is why the story endured. It gave narrative shape to a diffuse failure. The city of Troy could be blamed, burned, remembered. But the deeper causes, the loss of coordination, the erosion of trust, the shrinking of margins, were too abstract to turn into story. So they became background. History, however, preserves them. When we strip away the poetry, Troy appears not as the beginning of chaos, but as a moment when a stressed system chose a violent solution to an economic problem and paid for that choice later in ways it could not predict. The war closed one gate. It opened many fractures. By the time the consequences of Troy's destruction became undeniable, no one connected them to the war itself. That is how delayed causality works. The generation that fought the war remembered sacrifice and victory. The generation after inherited instability without context. By the time shortages, migrations, and political fragmentation intensified, Troy had already become legend. Useful as a story, useless as an explanation. Systems rarely remember what weakened them. They remember what justified the weakening. Across the Aegean and Anatolia, power fragmented into smaller, more defensive units. Palatial authority declined. Administrative reach shortened. Regions that had once coordinated through shared networks now acted independently. This did not feel like collapse to those living through it. It felt like local survival. Kings focused inward. Communities prioritized immediate security. Trade narrowed. Innovation slowed, not because people became incapable, but because risk tolerance vanished. When margins shrink, experimentation feels dangerous. This is the quiet aftermath of large wars. The Trojan War did not end with a stable peace because the conditions that produced it were not resolved, only displaced. The desire to control access remained. The fear of dependence persisted. But the institutional framework that had once managed these tensions was gone. In its place, competition without regulation. This is where violence becomes chronic rather than episodic. Raiding replaces trade. Fortification replaces diplomacy. Alliances form and dissolve rapidly. None of this requires villainy. It emerges naturally when coordination costs exceed trust. The myths reflect this shift indirectly. Post-Trojan stories are not about founding new orders. They are about wandering, loss, betrayal, and return without restoration. Heroes survive, but societies do not recover around them. This narrative tone matters. It suggests a cultural awareness that something structural had broken, even if the mechanism remained invisible. Archaeologically, the pattern aligns. Settlements shrink. Long-distance exchange thins. Craft specialization declines. Writing systems disappear in some regions. Complexity retracts. This is not sudden destruction. It is simplification under stress. The Trojan War fits into this process not as a cause, but as an accelerant. It consumed resources that could not be easily replaced. It taught leaders that force could solve systemic problems, temporarily. It removed a node without building a replacement. All three outcomes reduced resilience. Once resilience declines below a certain threshold, systems become sensitive to disturbances that were previously manageable. A bat harvest becomes a crisis. A migration becomes a threat. A local conflict cascades. This is how collapses become visible. Not when the system breaks, but when it can no longer hide that it has been breaking for a long time. Troy's memory survived because it offered a clear moment to anchor meaning. A city fell. A war ended. A story could be told. What followed had no single image, no decisive battle, no obvious villain. So it faded into background. But background conditions shape outcomes more reliably than dramatic events. The Trojan War marks a moment when a complex system chose destruction over adaptation, and learned too late that destruction solves fewer problems than it appears to. The city burned once. The cost unfolded slowly, everywhere. The Trojan War endures because it feels decisive. A city burns. A deception succeeds. A long struggle finally ends. But decisiveness is not the same as resolution. What Troy ultimately reveals is a pattern far older and far broader than any single myth. When economic systems rely on narrow points of control, pressure does not disappear when those points are destroyed. It reappears elsewhere, less visible and harder to manage. The war removed a gatekeeper. It did not remove dependence. The Mycenaean world still relied on long-distance exchange. It still needed metals, grain, and stability across water and land. What it lost was a predictable structure around which that exchange had been organized. Without Troy, there was no central friction, but also no central coordination. This left power diffused and brittle. Diffused power feels liberating at first. No single city dominates. No single toll must be paid. Movement appears freer. But freedom without structure carries hidden costs. Negotiation multiplies. Risk increases. Enforcement weakens. Trust becomes local and short-lived. The system grows noisier. No authority can absorb shock for the whole. In such conditions, resilience depends on surplus of food, of labor, of patience. The Trojan War had already consumed much of that surplus. What remained was insufficient to rebuild complexity quickly. This is why the Bronze Age world did not simply recover. It reorganized downward. Smaller units, shorter horizons, reduced ambition, less specialization. Life continued, but at a lower level of coordination. The loss was not civilization itself, but scale. Scale is expensive to maintain, and once lost, it is difficult to restore. The Trojan War stands at the threshold of that contraction not because it caused it alone, but because it exemplified a dangerous choice, solving a systemic economic problem through total destruction rather than adaptation. That choice feels rational under pressure. It promises clarity, finality, an end to negotiation. But clarity achieved through annihilation often eliminates the very structures that made stability possible. The city that controlled access was removed. No system replaced it. What followed was not order, but fragmentation. This is why Troy remains useful as a story. It allows us to compress a long, uncomfortable truth into a single event. It gives form to a diffuse failure. It lets us believe that wars end problems rather than transform them. But history suggests something else. Wars that target choke points rarely end dependence. They change who bears it. They change how visible it is. They change how violently it returns. Troy fell because it sat at a gate. The world that destroyed it discovered that gates, once gone, are not replaced automatically by balance. They are replaced by uncertainty. And uncertainty, unmanaged, is more destabilizing than obstruction. The real legacy of Troy is not the horse, or the heroes, or the flames. It is the reminder that economic pressure, once militarized, rarely stops with its first victory. It ripples outward, reshaping systems in ways no participant fully intends or controls. The city disappeared. The consequences did not. The story of Troy survives because it feels complete. A beginning, a long struggle, a decisive end. But history rarely works that way. When we step back from the poetry, Troy does not appear as the cause of a collapse, nor as a simple moral lesson about pride or deception. It appears as a moment when a complex world, under economic pressure, chose destruction instead of adaptation, and then lived with the consequences of that choice. The war solved a visible problem. It removed a city that controlled access. It reopened routes that had been constrained. What it did not do was restore stability. The late Bronze Age world depended on coordination, trust, and surplus spread across long distances. Those qualities take time to build and very little time to lose. A decade of sustained warfare consumed reserves that could not be quickly replaced. When new pressures arrived, climate stress, migration, internal conflict, the system no longer had the capacity to absorb them smoothly. Troy became a symbol because symbols are easier to carry than systems. It gave later generations a place to point to and say, this is where it went wrong. But what went wrong was not a trick, or a woman, or a single decision. It was a pattern, the belief that economic friction can be permanently solved through force. History suggests otherwise. Force can remove obstacles. It rarely replaces structure. And without structure, freedom becomes instability. The city that once controlled the gate vanished in fire. The world that destroyed it entered an age of fragmentation, simplification, and loss of scale. Life continued, but at a different rhythm, smaller, narrower, more cautious. That is the quiet lesson Troy leaves behind. Not that wars are fought for love or honor, but that when pressure builds around choke points, violence becomes tempting and costly in ways that only appear later. Civilizations often recognize these costs only after stories have replaced memory. Troy fell once. Its consequences unfolded for generations.